Hello, everyone. Welcome to PyData Global. We are excited to have you join us. Feel free to use the chat to connect with fellow attendees and share your thoughts during the session. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A tab, and we'll address them at the right point in the presentation. But now it is my pleasure to introduce Irina Vidal. Irina is a ML engineer specialized in computer vision and NLP and is currently an AI tech lead at Mozilla. Let's give a warm welcome to Irina.
Thanks a bunch. Hi, everyone. I'm Irina. I'm very glad that you're joining today, this particular session. I suppose quite everybody is interested in LLMs and having them be a lot more trustworthy. I've already seen quite a few sessions in this PyData Global that kind of touch upon this subject. In this particular one, I'm making a few assumptions. To start with, I'm assuming that you are working already with AI and LLMs. You're probably already familiar with concepts like embeddings, retriever, why ground truth is necessary. And I'm also assuming that you're building software that is going to be using LLMs at its core. And you don't want to be spending too long trying to choose the best one for a use case. But maybe you're not publishing on NeurIPS. So some of the details of benchmarks and how evaluation works is not something that you give a thought constantly. Why I care about it is because I've been spending years doing computer vision and machine learning in the medical and a good bunch of that in the medical and the mobility sector. And then I've also spent some time doing NLP, again, in the mobility sector. Recently, I joined Mozilla.ai with a bunch of really good people who share the enthusiasm to open up these LLMs, make them more accessible, make it easier for developers everywhere to make the right choice, and ideally in an easy manner. The reason for me to be here is really to connect with the community, because I would really like to have a conversation to understand where the difficulties are, what makes it so hard to build software around LLMs without them going a bit haywire, and understand what actually you're looking for when you're building them. Okay, so let's get started. Today, we're going to be seeing, this is a spoiler, but we're going to be seeing that evaluation actually can mean many different things. That metrics that deal with your particular use case, with a task, like a classification or anything else, is really just one dimension, and we should be taking into account a lot more. And we're going to see a few tools to tackle these evaluations. Good. So then let's start with that. What do we mean with evaluation? And often, and this is part of I've been in this mess. Maybe we don't have to do that, or maybe we can do better. You start with this, right? Before you put something on production, before you roll something out, you're not entirely sure. So you start an LLM and you start trying to probe it. Maybe you start simple. In this particular case here, you might be comparing, this is from the chatbot Irina, you're comparing two models, trying to decide which one to go for. And in this case, you're thinking, okay, which one might do better with OCR? And you ask a question. And things look okay, so you might continue. And you may be asking about a particular time. So when did this fax arrive? With the correct answer here. And at some point you realize, they're failing. Okay. So that's something interesting. And then you may be wanting to push a little more to understand if it's a sycophantic model, because maybe the moment you start saying, "Oh, are you sure?" They said, "Oh, I'm sorry for the confusion," and that really annoying conversation starts. So, more often than not, this is where the evaluation starts and ends. At least, from talking with a bunch of people and in past experience, this is how it goes. And this can take a long time. And one of the disadvantages of doing it this way is, one, it takes a lot of human time, and two, it's only as good as the evaluator. If you're not systematic, you're going to miss tons of things. And let's be honest, we are going to be missing things. So there are other ways. I was curious to know what that looked like today. The closest thing to statistics around it came from a thread on Reddit. And it's already 1 year old. So this is a big disclaimer. Take this with a huge chunk of salt. And I'll let you take a look at the diagram for a second. My first question when I see this is whether the 17.5% that say they do not use a human to evaluate, are they doing any evaluation at all? Or are they just taking the first model their company told them they could use and push that to production? I'm not sure. But that means your users are the human evaluators, and their complaints are going to be the first time that you know that something's up. Not ideal, but we've all been there, so understandable. But now, what's the alternative, right? And when you start asking people, and the last couple of months since I joined the team in Brazil, I've been having a lot of conversations around, okay, but what are you using? What do you do? What would you like to be doing? And a lot of the sentences or a lot of the claims I'm hearing is, well, I don't have time to do proper evaluation, or I don't know how to do this precisely. It's really complicated out there. The landscape is complex, or I don't have the data, or my use case is super custom. And a lot of these reasons boil down to, well, I don't have a budget allocated for it. Because if you don't have time, or it would take too long to understand how to do it or to collect the data, that means there was no budget allocated to that. And that's a human problem, right? That's something between you and the company, so that everyone values evaluation sufficiently. But assuming that is solved, there's still the technical problem that things maybe should be easier. Now, another problem that people encounter is often they will say, well, there's benchmarks, right? So why can't I just go to a benchmark, go to the best model and use that for my use case? And there's two reasons why you shouldn't, but one actually came up already in, you can see it, you can see these two articles on Hugging Face. In one of the most popular benchmarks out there, there have been tons of errors detected. And not only that, depending on how the evaluation metrics are implemented and how the benchmark is used, the results are going to be wildly different. And those two factors make benchmarks maybe something not to trust completely when you're choosing an LLM. So where does that leave us? Sure, we're beyond the not doing anything. We know vibe checking is not enough. But however, a tip here, since you are going to be doing some vibe checking, start collecting problems now, because you're going to be using those samples in the later stages. So you're done with vibe checking, you've collected a little test set, and maybe you're lucky enough that there's people willing to give you their time to evaluate. Cherish them and be kind to them, because eventually they're going to say that they have a day job and they can't be your beta testers. And that's the moment where you realize that you really need to automate it. And for that, there's tools, thankfully. Now, what you want to be building is a pipeline that, very high level looks like this. You're starting off with some test data, ideally very close to your domain. You're going to put it through a model that you're testing. That's going to give you some predictions. And you're going to try to compare them with the correct answers. Those correct answers ideally come from humans, but you never know. Sometimes you can't, and you're going to have to, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, but you're going to have to generate them in a different way. But once you've got some kind of reference and you've got your predictions, you put it through some eyeballing from a human who says, yeah, it's okay or not, and you get a score. And that's how you're going to decide if a model is worth putting out there. Now, why is this process that seems straightforward enough so hard? we've talked about the difficulty with what data to use there. Getting your own is expensive, but using open source data sets might be from a different domain. And even if they are kind of close, they are riddled with problems. But there's also a different problem, which is we're dealing with generative models. And this means there's going to be a huge variance. There's going to be paraphrasing at every step. Regardless of whether you're doing translation, summarization, question answering, it's fairly hard to evaluate to how correct a sentence is. So assuming this first line is your reference, you as humans, are you able to tell me if we should accept the second and third line as a paraphrase? Are they saying the same thing? It's not exactly the same thing, but do we reject it? Do we not? It's not easy for a human. So if it's not easy for a human, it's definitely not easy for an LLM either. So let's say we're kind of okay with that. What do we need to set up an automated quantitative evaluation? We need that measurable task. So let's say we've got summarization. We look for metrics that are going to evaluate that. Then ideally that metric should be linked to the business, because when it isn't, that's when you're going to end up doing vibe checking anyway. When you build the whole system, you're going to need to have your own eyes evaluating, and we're back to square one. Not ideal. So try to have a metric that is kind of aligned with the business. You also want clean domain data, right? So your own data cleaned up, prepped to do a proper evaluation. Ideally labeled. Yeah, that's tough. Possibly you will have to find second best. Now, with that, what you can do is replace that human eyeballing. You will want to replace it with an assessment based on that metric and on some code. And for that, there's tools. And here we can also talk about this in the Q&A if you want, but there's multiple types of metrics depending on what you want. So some are word-based, some are operating in the embedding space, some are using an LLM as a judge. None of them is perfect, and they kind of, I can't even say they complement each other, because some of them are, because you're not going to cover everything, but at least you can play around, combine them, and get at the end some score. And good, for that, there's already tools. And the people I work with are particular fans of Hugging Face Evaluate. Deep Eval is also really good. There's a Luther's LM Eval harness. And spoiler, we are playing around at integrating them in tools like Lumigator, the one Attila AI is building. And ideally, once you're combining them, you're done, right? You can say, well, this is the one that has the highest score. This is the best. Are we done? Of course not. It's never that easy. A colleague of mine would argue that you're not done even for task performance. And I'm going to argue, even if that were completely solved, if we were happy, you would still have a ton to do, because task performance is just one of those dimensions. There's a bunch of other things that you need to pay attention to before you roll out something, because there's the risk that even the best model for those particular metrics that are related to the task is leaking user data. Maybe it's impossible to explain or to understand how it's operating, so you won't be able to really debug it later on. Maybe it's extremely toxic, and it's very easy to get it to produce some content that you really do not want out there associated to your name. Or maybe it's very easy to break, because you can just start poking it and it will break apart. And it would be really nice if we could have metrics for all of those. I would argue that even if we're going, so a few of those are really, really hard to quantify. Today, we're going to see these three that are a bit easier. We've talked about task performance already, and we've seen how that can be easily, and I say that very, very loosely, translated to a metric. wouldn't it be nice if we could translate all of the others to metrics as well, to have maybe a visualization that looks like something like this? Because one thing that is very clear is that no model is going to be perfect, and you're not going to be able to max out all of the stats right here. So at least you need to make an informed choice by saying, well, my model is really good at the task, but it's really, really weak and very easy to break, or it's leaking data very easily. You need to be able to make those kind of informed choices. Now, what are we talking about? And then let's dive a little into those particular features or factors that ideally you can quantify. Inside robustness, we're talking about hallucinations. That's one of the things. For example, we can include that there. And we've already seen cases that went really badly in the wild and in production. So maybe a couple of years ago, you didn't see them that often, but we've already seen, for example, a chatbot commissioned by the New York City, where there was incorrect information given to employers and to landlords. This is really, really not good, right? There's also the aspect of actively probing and poking your model to see how easily it might break. And in the concept of red teaming, you can see things like prompt attacks and jailbreaks. This screenshot is taken from Giscard, which is a really nice tool that provides reports. So it operates. It's similar to Garak, and I'll link them both in a second, and we'll make the slides available. And the nice thing about it is that it operates like Nmap. It's just like you could be probing ports for vulnerabilities. You can probe your LL model with lots of known attacks and start poking it, and at the end you end up having a report stating all of the ones that were successful. And that can be extremely helpful, and it can be translated to some metric that you can later compare. And last of all, if you thought that vision models were not affected, or vision-enabled language models were not affected, they are, and in a very similar manner to this. If you're interested in computer vision, you probably saw this now 10 years ago. Well, this is coming back, or actually never went away. And currently, there are attacks for multimodal language models or vision-enabled language models in a very similar manner. For example, you can craft noise in an optimized way so that added to an input image, they generate a string, a caption, that tricks an LLM into doing something that it shouldn't. And I really encourage you to read. So I've got this paper linked here. It's an interesting read, so to speak. And it's one of the ways where that makes a lot of the attacks for vision-enabled models come precisely because of the images. Because you can, it's a whiteboard, it's a white box attack, but it's the way into these models to trick them. And of course, another factor is, and it's never nice to talk about it, but it's how, in the end, LLMs reflect the biases and the problems that humans show. So you do see a lot of toxicity and bias, and there's also tools that can allow you to measure that and warn you when these are detected. Now, as far as tools go, one very interesting read can be, this one is non-peer reviewed, but it's a good comparison of some of the tools that allow you to probe these LLMs. So it compares them, and it can tell you where each of them specializes, or at least 4 of the bigger ones. Giscard is from a French company, and it's the screenshot that I was showing you in the earlier slide comes from them. Garak is by NVIDIA. Both are really, really interesting to look at and to use. For hallucinations, if you're already using LM hardness, you may want to be using Patronus because you can use an LLM to observe another LLM and signal, hey, I'm observing hallucinations. And regarding fairness and a library called FairLearn, there's actually in this same PyData Global, there was a couple of days ago a nice workshop around it. And if you're extremely motivated by this, Mozilla is organizing a bug bounty project called Odin. And yeah, look it up and maybe participate. So let's recap. We know that vibe checks are not enough, hopefully. We know that, again, hopefully we know now that using test metrics is also not enough. And even in the very few tools, I've been fairly careful not to list way too many and to try to just talk about the most popular, more mature tools that we're finding to assess these vulnerabilities or these problems in LLMs. But even with that, you might be overwhelmed at how many open source tools there are, and they're wonderful to use, and they're really useful. But it might be necessary to find tools that kind of plug them together and produce a single overview of how your LLM is doing. And I would be really interested in knowing whether this resonates with you, and if there would be any other way selecting an LLM might be easier for people. Now, from where I'm standing, it looks like what we want to do is replace that part where we had a human eyeballing or some automated pipeline. We just want a black box where you can send in your own data, send in the models that you might be interested in, and get out a series of metrics that you can later compare. And in that black box, you want to factor in all of these dimensions. And thankfully, there are several open source tools, there are dozens of open source tools that can help. And a few of them are rather mature, and we think at least that they are very much worth integrating to produce this kind of overview of metrics. So what's next? My call to action to you would be start thinking that there's more dimensions to choosing an LLM. So it's not just the task, there's a lot more that you need to think about. This means also that there's no way of having a perfect model that just hits all the boxes, just like with humans. So you need to prioritize what can you live with, what is a complete must. And you also need to find a way of quantifying that. So I would love to talk about how to make that easy. What would that integration look like? What do you find hard? What would you hope to get out of a tool that is kind of plugging all of these together? And what would make your life easier when you're building software that is using LLMs? And yeah, so again, get in touch. There's a number of channels you can get in touch with me or with everyone on the team. And thank you very much for being here, for your attention.
All right, I see some applause, well-earned applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. We do you have a question that, if you don't mind, I could put on stage if you want to address? You can see that.
Yeah, I'm seeing some questions. So I'm seeing, will you be getting? Yeah, the slides will be made public. Absolutely. I mean, if the code is open source, so will the slides.
And then this question here, do you also have any experience, advice on the use of RAGis package for evaluating LLM for both context retrieval via RAG and generation of inference results?
Yeah, so I didn't include RAGis here because it has a fairly niche use in RAG. At the same time, RAG is absolutely everywhere. But yeah, it's a staple. So I guess it definitely deserves a spot in there.
I also have another question. How much testing is enough testing?
That's a super good question. Actually, today with a colleague, we were talking about how maybe for how long do you go? Even if you stay with vibe checking, for how long, how many rounds would you go seeing whether it breaks or whether it not breaks? Is that another parameter that you would include in the test? So it depends on, I guess the answer is, how much money do you have? How much budget can you spend on this just to be extra sure?
Another question. By putting too many guardrails, the model becomes risk adverse. Do you agree?
Actually, this is one factor as well. I mean, you need to, you can't overload the slides, right? But the refusal to answer is one other way that a model could be not too reliable or not too robust. So it's actually yet something more that could become a metric. So this is actually, so all of these are not about guardrails. There are other packages that deal with guardrails. NVIDIA also has one that is open source and pretty nice. But all of this is happening before you put guardrails on top. All of these tools are there to tell you how weak or how strong a model is going to be. So for example, if you're also factoring in the tendency to not want to answer, even before the guardrails, that is something you can take into account to say, okay, this model, when it does stare, it's fairly accurate or it's fairly robust, but at the same time, it always fails in that 10% of the time it refuses to answer. So that is something that you could factor in. And then of course you could end up having all those guardrails, and if you overdo it, yes, you could have a model that does nothing. But again, this is all a balance, right? You need to optimize multiple factors here.
Well, I think we are almost out of time, so maybe this is a good place to wrap up. Thank you again for presenting, and thanks to everyone for joining us. If you would like to continue discussion, we do have our Discord. The link is available in the reception area, and the recording of the session will be available shortly for rewatching. But for now, I want to thank everyone again, and let's give Irina a nice round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.